Is this fully edited wildlife photograph crossing ethical lines? In this video, I'll show you the full edit step by step and give my honest take on what I think about it. Stay tuned for a free Lightroom preset inspired by this editing style. I'll share that on the screen here. While I go through the edit, share your thoughts in the comments below whether you think this editing style is going too far. Let's jump into Lightroom. I'm going to stay 100% in Lightroom for this edit. I'm going to reset the photo to make sure all the sliders are at 0. Select Adobe Standard as my profile, and remove chromatic aberration under lens corrections, and I'll just turn off the sharpening for now. Now I want to go for a very dark edit to this, so I'm going to drop the exposure quite a bit. The blacks might start clipping on the left of the histogram there, but I'm going to open the blacks with this slider. Going to bring in some white contrast, not too much. I don't want to add too much contrast. I want this to be a dark and very soft contrasty edit. Might open up the shadows there. Maybe the whites are too high, especially on this chest area over there. Maybe something like that for now. I'm really going to darken this image through some masking now. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a vignette. I'm going to just place that radial gradient over the face, invert that. And then I'm going to darken that quite a bit. I'm going to make sure this is feathered. And I might just darken that, but raise the blacks a little bit, just to add a little bit less contrast to that darkened area. Perhaps something like that. Maybe just open that a little bit there. Then I'm going to select my subject. I want to increase the exposure just on the face. So I'm going to make sure that my subject selection is refined here. There's a couple of spots there. I'm just going to subtract a brush just on that spot there. That's a little fly. And I'm just going to then add a brush to this section on the bottom. I'm using a soft-edged brush here. You can see I'm just painting with the very edge of that brush just to add in those areas there. Okay, that's looking pretty good. I'm going to subtract a linear gradient from this subject selection because I don't want to brighten the bottom piece of the subject very much. So very feathered linear gradients I'm just removing from that subject mask. Maybe something like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to intersect this entire selection with a radial gradient just to feather this increase in exposure away from the edges slightly. I don't want to have a very abrupt edge to that subject. I want to feather that selection. And I'm just going to increase that exposure very slightly there. Perhaps open up this feathering a little bit. Maybe something like that. It creates a little bit of a spotlight on the face there. Nothing too much. Maybe that's a bit strong, so I'm just going to take this amount down just a touch. And now I'm going to do what I call fading the blacks. If you've downloaded my Lightroom Tools preset pack, I've got a couple of presets here, Black Fade 2. I'm probably going to use Black Fade 1 because it's going to roll off the contrast on that very deep black in the image. Just adjust this contrast. I feel like it needs a little bit more contrast, maybe a little bit more exposure. I feel like it's becoming a bit too flat. All right, so now I'm going to work in the tone curve. I like the brightness on this leopard. I want to increase a little bit of the contrast in the midtones. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop this area on the tone curve a bit, increase a little bit of contrast there. And then I'm going to drop the brightness in the very strong highlights in the image. Actually, I might just drop some highlights here a little bit. I just want to soften this out a bit more. Maybe increase some of the shadows. And now what I want to do again, I'm going to use a subject selection. Just going to add in this little area here. Again, I'm just going to subtract a linear gradient because I'm going to apply some detail now to the subject just to make it pop a little bit more. Just some clarity. Maybe a little bit of texture as well. Looking at the image now, I feel like there's too much of a spotlight on the face and it's looking a little bit unnatural. So I'm going to go back to my vignette. Just going to increase that exposure just a bit. I think we darkened it a bit too much. Perhaps something like that. And now I want to look at the darks in the image. Apply a blue tint to the darks. I've got a preset there that does that for me. Going to just go back to this shadow blue. Just decrease the amount. Perhaps around about there somewhere. Now I want to change the color of the leopard and also desaturate some of the colors. And that desaturating on certain colors in the image will help bring out that very dark mood. Go to color mix. So the first thing I'm going to do is take away the red of this nose. I feel like that is very eye-catching. I wanted to make that color very subtle. I'm going to change the color of the leopard just to a more, almost a more orangey color. And that color will work very nicely with the blue tint that we've applied. So I'm actually going to go back to that shadow blue and just increase that slightly. All right, that's looking a lot better. I can see a very bright spot in the background, which is very pink. So I'm just going to do a brush mask over there. I'll just zoom in so you can see what I'm doing. And then I'm going to apply point color. I'm going to select that pink. You can see that pink there in the magnifying glass. Select that. Just going to desaturate that away. Right, that's looking a bit better. Now I'm going to play around with some linear gradients. I want to just add more of a vignette, but more of a controlled vignette. Just to soften out some of these areas, just to simplify the image a bit. Something like that, perhaps one from the top. I will use a linear gradient, but what I'll do is I'll subtract the subject from that linear gradient and just darken that a bit there. That just helps the subject stand out a little bit. Play around with a little bit of exposure. And I think maybe in the tone curve here, I might raise up some of these blacks just a bit. It's getting a bit too dark where I don't want it to get dark. Perhaps around about there. Maybe drop those midtones again. Now I want to add in a bit more contrast to this. And I think I'm going to go to the parametric curve here. Just want to drop some of these darks and increase some of these lights just to add in a bit more contrast and increase the shadows a little bit. So that's really helping me bring out some nice contrast, but also at the same time making the image a lot darker. I think what's throwing me off here, there's a bit too much color in the image. I want to desaturate this just to help with that darker mood. Something like that. And maybe some color grading in the shadows. I'm going to add some blue to the shadows. Around about there perhaps. Drop some of that contrast. Change the balance. Maybe add in a bit more. It's getting very dark. Just increase the exposure a little bit. Now, because the light is coming from sort of the front of the leopard, I want to darken the right-hand side. So I'm just going to use a radial gradient. Decrease that feathering a little bit there. Darken that there. Really bring in attention to the leopard's face. I'm going to make another radial gradient. I want to darken this leg section. Standing out a little bit there. Drop some highlights. Maybe drop the contrast and exposure just to flatten that out a bit. Okay, that's looking a bit better. And now I just want to burn some parts of the leopard's face. I'm going to perhaps drop it to about minus 0.87 on the exposure. And then I'm just going to paint in the areas that I think should be a bit darker, where that light is not falling. I'm going to increase the exposure now. I think it's just too dark, but you can see I'm just going to darken some of these areas here, perhaps on the leg. It's a very broad selection there, but I'm going to just fine-tune that drop in exposure. You can see just adding that little bit of darkening just helps emphasize that bit of light coming through. I'm going to subtract a brush. I think I've gone over the face a bit too much here. Maybe on the ear here a little bit. Perhaps something like that. I'm going to drop the highlights a little bit. I think they're getting a bit too strong. Increase some shadows. And I think the nose here needs some darkening. Just going to add another brush, some negative exposure. Just a small amount. It's a very bright section there. I'm just going to go back to that initial radial gradient we created for the vignette. And then adjust the entire exposure down. Let's just throw in some more contrast here. I think this might work quite nicely. I'm liking the contrast on the image. I think the blacks are slightly too dark still. Perhaps something like that. And now I want to throw in a little bit of light on the background. Very subtle little bit of light there. I'm going to subtract a select subject, increase the exposure very slightly, increase the black slider, and add in some negative dehaze, and perhaps warm it up slightly. Very subtle effect. You can see that's off and on. It just adds a little bit to the image. Just move that around. Going to go to color grading. I want to add some more blue. And perhaps play with the white balance. I think maybe warm it up very slightly. Just increase some more color contrast there. I'll zoom in onto the eyes. Just want to add some clarity to those eyes with a brush. Just on that very bright section of the eye there. And over here. Add in some whites. And then I might just increase the contrast and clarity on the entire eye. Just with a simple brush again. Let's go to clarity. And then perhaps some exposure, just a little bit, not too much. Something like that effect. And then perhaps drop some more saturation. I feel like there's just one area. It looks like the face is popping too much with exposure, so I'm just going to use a radial gradient. Just want to brighten this rough area here, just to better transition between the very dark bottom of the image and the face. I think that's a bit more natural looking. I just want to eliminate some more of the color in the image. Go to saturation. I don't think there's many greens. I'm just going to drop the saturation on all of these sliders. I literally only want mostly the oranges and the yellows to come through in terms of color. Just going to drop this hue a little bit here. And then perhaps add some more color grading into the shadows. For something like that. The last thing I would do is go into detail just to add some sharpening. Hit Alt to mask the image. Don't want to sharpen out of focus areas. Drop the radius down and the detail. I think this, in terms of my opinion, is acceptable. I don't think it's altering the scene at all. I'm perhaps recreating a little bit of light here. What I would possibly do is remove this branch, which then would come into question whether it's ethical or not. And if you enjoy this darker editing style, check out the techniques in this video to help you achieve even more dramatic and moody edits on your wildlife photographs.